The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. Part 7 of the Systems of Moral Philosophy. Section 4 of the manner in which different authors have treated of the practical rules of morality. It was observed in the third part of this discourse that the rules of justice are the only rules of morality which are precise and accurate, that those of all other virtues are loose, vague, and indeterminate, that the first may be compared to the rules of grammar, the others to those which critics lay down for the attainment of what is sublime and elegant in composition, and which present us rather with a general idea of the perfection we ought to aim at, than afford us any certain and infallible directions for acquiring it. As the different rules of morality admit such different degrees of accuracy, those authors who have endeavored to collect and digest them into systems have done it in two different manners, and one set has followed through the whole that loose method to which they were naturally directed by the consideration of one species of virtues, while another has universally endeavored to introduce into their precepts that sort of accuracy of which only some of them are susceptible. The first have wrote like critics, the second like grammarians. The first among whom we may count all the ancient moralists, have contented themselves with describing in a general manner the different vices and virtues, and with pointing out the deformity and misery of the one disposition as well as the propriety and happiness of the other, but have not affected to lay down many precise rules that are to hold good unexceptionably in all particular cases. They have only endeavored to ascertain, as far as language is capable of ascertaining, first, wherein consists the sentiment of the heart, upon which each particular virtue is founded, what sort of internal feeling or emotion it is which constitutes the essence of friendship, of humanity, of generosity, of justice, of magnanimity, and of all the other virtues, as well as that of vices, which are opposed to them; and secondly, what is the general way of acting, the ordinary tone and tenor of conduct to which each of those sentiments would direct us, or how it is that a friendly, a generous, a brave, a just, and a humane man would, upon ordinary occasions, choose to act. To characterize the sentiment of the heart, upon which each particular virtue is founded, though it requires both a delicate and accurate pencil, is a task, however, which may be executed with some degree of exactness. It is impossible, indeed, to express all the variations which each sentiment either does or ought to undergo, according to every possible variation of circumstances. They are endless, and language wants names to mark them by. The sentiment of friendship, for example, which we feel for an old man, is different from that which we feel for a young; that which we entertain for an austere man different from that which we feel for one of softer and gentler manners; and that again from what we feel for one of gay vivacity and spirit. The friendship which we conceive for a man is different from that which a woman affects us, even where there is no mixture of any grosser passion. What author could enumerate and ascertain these and all other infinite varieties which this sentiment is capable of undergoing? But still the general sentiment of friendship and familiar attachment, which is common to them all, may be ascertained with a sufficient degree of accuracy. The picture which is drawn of it, though it will always be in many respects incomplete, may, however, have such a resemblance as to make us know the original when we meet with it, and even distinguish it from other sentiments to which it has a considerable resemblance, such as goodwill, respect, esteem, and admiration. To describe in a general manner what is the ordinary way of acting to which each virtue would prompt us, is still more easy; it is indeed scarce possible to describe the internal sentiment or emotion upon which it is founded, without doing something of this kind. It is impossible by language to express, if I may say so, the invisible features of all the different modifications of passion, as they show themselves within. There is no other way of marking and distinguishing them from one another, but by describing the effects which they produce without the alterations which they occasion in the countenance, in the air and internal behavior. The resolutions they suggest, the actions they prompt to, it is thus that Cicero, in the first book of his Offices, endeavors to direct us to that practice of the four cardinal virtues, and that Aristotle, in the practical parts of his Ethics, points out to us the different habits by which he would have had us regulate our behavior, such as liberality, magnificence, magnanimity, and even jocularity and good humor, qualities which that indulgent philosopher has thought worthy of a place in the catalogue of the virtues, though the lightness of that approbation which we naturally bestow upon them should not seem to entitle them to so honourable a name. Such works present us with agreeable and lively pictures of manners. By the vivacity of their description, they inflame our natural love of virtue, and increase our abhorrence of vice. By the justness as well as the delicacy of their observations, they may often help both to correct and to ascertain our natural sentiments with regard to the propriety of conduct, and suggesting many nice and delicate attentions, form us to a more exact justness of behavior than what, without such instructions, we should have been apt to think of. In treating of the rules of morality in this manner consists a science which is properly called ethics, a science which, though like criticism it does not admit of the most accurate precision, is, however, both highly useful and agreeable. It is of all others the most susceptible to the embellishments of eloquence, and by the means of them of bestowing, if that be possible, a new importance upon the smallest rules of duty. Its precepts, when thus dressed and adorned, are capable of producing upon the flexibility of youth the noblest and most lasting impressions, and as they fall in with the natural magnanimity of that generous age, they are able to inspire, for a time at least, the most heroic resolutions, and thus tend both to establish and confirm the best and most useful habits of which the mind of man is susceptible. Whatever precept and exhortation can do to animate us to the practice of virtue is done by this science delivered in this manner. The second set of moralists, among whom we may account all the casuists of the middle and latter ages of the Christian Church, as well as all those who in this and the preceding century have treated of what is called natural jurisprudence, do not content themselves with characterizing in this general manner that tenor of conduct which they would recommend to us, but endeavor to lay down exact and precise rules for the direction of every circumstance of our behavior. As justice is the only virtue with regard to which such exact rules can properly be given, it is this virtue that has chiefly befallen under the consideration of those two different sets of writers. They treat of it, however, in a very different manner. Those who write upon the principles of jurisprudence consider only what the person to whom the obligation is due ought to think himself entitled to exact by force, what every impartial spectator would approve of him for exacting, or what a judge or arbiter to whom he had submitted his case, and who had undertaken to do him justice, ought to oblige the other person to suffer or to perform. The casuists, on the other hand, do not so much examine what it is that might properly be exacted by force, as what it is that the person who owes the obligation ought to think himself bound to perform from the most sacred and scrupulous regard to the general rules of justice, and from the most conscientious dread either of wronging his neighbor or of violating the integrity of his own character. It is the end of jurisprudence to prescribe rules for the decisions of judges and arbiters. It is the end of casuistry to prescribe rules for the conduct of a good man. By observing all the rules of jurisprudence, supposing them ever so perfect, we should deserve nothing but to be free from external punishment. By observing those of casuistry, supposing them such as they ought to be, we should be entitled to considerable praise by the exactness and scrupulous delicacy of our behavior. It may frequently happen that a good man ought to think himself bound, from a sacred and conscientious regard to the general rules of justice, to perform many things which it would be the highest injustice to extort from him, or for any judge or arbiter to impose upon him by force. To give a trite example, a highwayman, by the fear of death, obliges a traveller to promise him a certain sum of money. Whether such a promise, extorted in this manner, by unjust force, ought to be regarded as obligatory, is a question that has been very much debated. If we consider it merely as a question of jurisprudence, the decision can admit of no doubt. It would be absurd, to suppose that the highwayman can be entitled to use force to constrain the other to perform. To extort the promise was a crime which deserved the highest punishment, and to extort the performance would only be adding a new crime to the former. He can complain of no injury who has been only deceived by the person by whom he might justly have been killed. To suppose that a judge ought to enforce the obligation of such promises, or that the magistrate ought to allow them to sustain action at law, would be the most ridiculous of all absurdities. If we consider this question, therefore, as a question of jurisprudence, we can be at no loss about the decision. But if we consider it as a question of casuistry, it will not be so easily determined, whether a good man from a conscientious regard to that most sacred rule of justice, which commands the observance of all serious promises, would not think himself bound to perform, is at least much more doubtful, that no regard is due to the disappointment of the wretch who brings him into this situation, that no injury is done to the robber, and consequently that nothing can be extorted by force, will admit of no sort of dispute. But whether some regard is not, in this case, due to his own dignity and honor, to the inviolable sacredness of that part of his character which makes him reverence the law of truth and abhor everything that approaches to treachery and falsehood, may, perhaps, be more reasonably be made a question. The casuists, accordingly, are greatly divided about it. One party, with whom we may count Cicero, among the ancients, among the moderns Puffendorf Barbeyrac, his commentator, and, above all, the late Dr. Hutcheson, one who in most cases was by no means a loose casuist, determine without any hesitation that no sort of regard is due to any such promise, and that to think otherwise is mere weakness and superstition. Another party, among whom we may reckon some of the ancient fathers of the Church, as well as some very eminent modern casuists, have been of another opinion, and have judged all such promises obligatory. If we consider the matter according to the common sentiments of mankind, we shall find that some regard would be thought due even to a promise of this kind, but that it is impossible to determine how much, by any general rule that will apply to all cases without exception. The man who was quite frank and easy in making promises of this kind, and who violated them with as little ceremony, we should not choose for our friend and companion. A gentleman who should promise a highwayman £5 and not perform, would incur some blame. If the sum promised, however, was very great, it might be more doubtful what was proper to be done. If it was such, for example, that the payment of it would entirely ruin the family of the promiser, if it was so great as to be sufficient for promoting the most useful purposes, it would appear in some measure criminal, at least extremely improper, to throw it, for the sake of a punctilio, into such worthless hands. The man who should beggar himself, or who should throw away £100,000, though he could afford that vast sum, for the sake of observing such a parole with a thief, would appear the common sense of mankind, absurd and extravagant in the highest degree. Such profusion would seem inconsistent with his duty, with what he owed both to himself and others, and what, therefore, regard to a promise extorted in this manner could by no means authorize. To fix, however, by any precise rule, what degree of regard ought to be paid to it, or what might be the greatest sum which could be due from it, is evidently impossible. This would vary according to the characters of the persons, according to their circumstances, according to the solemnity of the promise, and even according to the incidents of the rencounter, and if the promiser had been treated with a great deal of that sort of gallantry which is sometimes to be met with of persons of the most abandoned characters, more would seem due than upon other occasions. It may be said in general that exact propriety requires the observance of all such promises, wherever it is not inconsistent with some other duties that are more sacred, such as regard to the public interest, to those whom gratitude, whom natural affection, or whom the laws of proper beneficence should prompt us to provide for. But as was formerly taken notice of, we have no precise rules to determine what external actions are due from a regard to such motives, nor consequently when it is that those virtues are inconsistent with the observance of such promises. It is to be observed, however, that whenever such promises are violated, though for the most necessary reasons, it is always with some degree of dishonor to the person who made them. After they are made, we may be convinced of the impropriety of observing them, but still there is some fault in having made them. It is at least a departure from the highest and noblest maxims of magnanimity and honor. A brave man ought to die rather than make a promise which he can neither keep without folly nor violate without ignominy. For some degree of ignominy always attends a situation of this kind. Treachery and falsehood are vices so dangerous, so dreadful, and at the same time such as may so easily, and upon many occasions so safely, be indulged, that we are more jealous of them than of almost any other. Our imagination, therefore, attaches the idea of shame to all violations of faith, in every circumstance and in every situation. They resemble in this respect the violations of chastity in the fair sex, a virtue of which, for the like reasons, we are excessively jealous, and our sentiments are not more delicate with regard to the one than with regard to the other. Breach of chastity dishonors irretrievably. No circumstances, no solicitation can excuse it. No sorrow, no repentance atone for it. We are so nice in this respect that even a rape dishonors, and the innocence of the mind cannot, in our imagination, wash out the pollution of the body. It is the same case with the violation of faith, when it has been solemnly pledged even to the most worthless of mankind. Fidelity is so necessary a virtue that we apprehend it in general to be due even to those to whom nothing else is due, and whom we think it lawful to kill and destroy. It is to no purpose that the person who has been guilty of the breach of it urges that he promised in order to save his life, and that he broke his promise because it was inconsistent with some other respectable duty to keep it. These circumstances may alleviate, but cannot entirely wipe out, his dishonor. He appears to have been guilty of an action with which, in the imaginations of men, some degree of shame is inseparably connected. He has broke a promise which he has solemnly averred he would maintain, and his character, if not irretrievably stained and polluted, has at least ridicule affixed to it, which it will be very difficult entirely to efface, and no man, I imagine, who had gone through an adventure of this kind would be fond of telling the story. This instance may serve to show wherein consists the difference between casuistry and jurisprudence, even when both of them consider the obligations of the general rules of justice. But though this difference be real and essential, though those two sciences propose quite different ends, the sameness of the subject has made such similarity between them, that the greater part of authors whose professed design was to treat of jurisprudence have determined the different questions they examine, sometimes according to the principles that science, and sometimes according to those of casuistry, without distinguishing, and perhaps without being themselves aware when they did the one and when the other. The doctrine of casuists, however, is by no means confined to the consideration of what a conscientious regard to the general rules of justice would demand of us. It embraces many other parts of Christian and moral duty. What seems principally to have given occasion to the cultivation of this species of science was the custom of auricular confession, introduced by the Roman Catholic superstition, in times of barbarism and ignorance. By that institution, the most secret actions, and even the thoughts of every person, which could be suspected of receding, in the smallest degree, from the rules of Christian purity, were to be revealed to the confessor. The confessor informed his penitents whether and in what respect they had violated their duty, and what penance it behoved them to undergo, before he could absolve them in the name of the offended deity. The consciousness or even the suspicion of having done wrong is a load upon every mind, and is accompanied with anxiety and terror in all those who are not hardened by the long habits of iniquity. Men in this, as in all other distresses, are naturally eager to disburthen themselves of the oppression which they feel upon their thoughts, by unbosoming the agony of their mind to some person whose secrecy and discretion they can confide in. The shame which they suffer from this acknowledgment is fully compensated by that deviation of their uneasiness which the sympathy of their confidence seldom fails to occasion. It relieves them to find that they are not altogether unworthy of regard, and that however their past conduct may be censured, their present disposition is at least approved of, and is perhaps sufficient to compensate the other, at least to maintain them in some degree of esteem with their friend. A numerous and artful clergy had, in those times of superstition, insinuated themselves into the confidence of almost every private family. They possessed all the little learnings which the times could afford, and their manners, though in many respects rude and disorderly, were polished and regular compared with those of the age they lived in. They were regarded, therefore, not only as the great directors of all religious, but of all moral duties. Their familiarity gave reputation to whoever was so happy as to possess it, and every mark of their disapprobation stamped the deepest ignominy upon all who had the misfortune to fall under it. Being considered as the great judges of right and wrong, they were naturally consulted about all scruples that occurred, and it was reputable for any person to have it known that he made those holy men the confidence of all such secrets, and took no important or delicate step in his conduct without their advice and approbation. It was not difficult for the clergy, therefore, to get it established as a general rule that they should be entrusted with what it had already become fashionable to entrust them, and with what they generally would have been entrusted, though no such rule had been established. To qualify themselves for confessors became thus a necessary part of the study of churchmen and divines, and they were thence led to collect what are called cases of conscience, nice and delicate situations in which it is hard to determine whereabouts the propriety of conduct may lie. Such works, they imagined, might be of use both to the directors of consciences and to those who were to be directed, and hence the origin of books of casuistry. The moral duties which fell under the consideration of the casuists were chiefly those which can in some measure at least be circumscribed with general rules, and which of the violation is naturally attended with some degree of remorse and some dread of suffering punishment. The design of that institution which gave occasion to their works was to appease those terrors of conscience which attend upon the infringement of such duties. But it is not every virtue of which the defect is accompanied with any very severe compunctions of this kind, and no man applies to his confessor for absolution, because he did not perform the most generous, the most friendly, or the most magnanimous action which in his circumstances it is possible to perform. In failures of this kind, the rule that is violated is commonly not very determinate, and is generally of such a nature too, that though the observance of it might entitle to honor and reward, the violation seems to expose to no positive blame, censure, or punishment. The exercise of such virtues the casuists seem to have regarded as a sort of works of supererogation which could not be very strictly exacted, and which it was therefore unnecessary for them to treat of. The breaches of moral duty, therefore, which came before the tribunal of the confessor, and upon that account fell under the cognizance of the casuists, were chiefly of three different kinds. First and principally, breaches of the rules of justice. The rules here are all express and positive, and the violation of them is naturally attended with the consciousness of deserving, and the dread of suffering punishment from both God and man. Secondly, breaches of the rules of chastity. These in all grosser instances are real breaches of the rules of justice, and no person can be guilty of them without doing the most unpardonable injury to some other. In small instances, when they amount only to the violation of those exact decorums which ought to be observed in the conversation of the two sexes, they cannot indeed justly be considered as violations of the rules of justice. They are generally, however, violations of a pretty plain rule, and at least in one of the sexes tend to bring ignominy upon the person who has been guilty of them, and consequently to be attended in the scrupulous with some degree of shame and contrition of mind. Thirdly, breaches of the rules of veracity. The violation of truth, it is to be observed, is not always a breach of justice, though it is so upon many occasions, and consequently cannot always expose to any external punishment. The vice of common lying, though a most miserable meanness, may frequently do hurt to nobody, and in this case no claim of vengeance or satisfaction can be due either to the persons imposed upon or to others. But though the violation of truth is not always a breach of justice, it is always a breach of a very plain rule, and what naturally tends to cover with shame the person who has been guilty of it. There seems to be in young children an instinctive disposition to believe whatever they are told. Nature seems to have judged it necessary for their preservation that they should, for some time at least, put implicit confidence in those whom the care of their childhood, and of the earliest and most necessary parts of their education, is entrusted. Their credulity, accordingly, is excessive, and it requires long and much experience of the falsehood of mankind to reduce them to a reasonable degree of diffidence and distrust. In grown-up people the degrees of credulity are, no doubt, very different. The wisest and most experienced are generally the least credulous, but the man scarce lives who is not more credulous than he ought to be, and who does not upon many occasions give credit to tales which not only turn out to be perfectly false, but which a very moderate degree of reflection and attention might have taught him could not well be true. The nature of disposition is always to believe. It is acquired wisdom and experience only that teach incredulity, and they very seldom teach it enough. The wisest and most cautious of us all frequently give credit to stories which he himself is afterwards both ashamed and astonished that he could possibly think of believing. The man who we believe is necessarily, in the things concerning which we believe him, our leader and director, and we look up to him with a certain degree of esteem and respect, but as far admiring other people, we come to wish to be admired ourselves. So from being led and directed by other people, we learn to wish to become ourselves leaders and directors. And as we cannot always be satisfied merely with being admired, unless we can at the same time persuade ourselves that we are in some degree really worthy of admiration, so we cannot always be satisfied merely with being believed, unless we are at the same time conscious that we are really worthy of belief. As the desire of praise and that of praiseworthiness, though very much akin, are yet distinct and separate desires, so the desire of being believed and that of being worthy of belief, though very much akin too, are equally distinct and separate desires. The desire of being believed, the desire of persuading, of leading and directing other people, seems to be one of the strongest of all our natural desires. It is perhaps the instinct upon which is founded the faculty of speech. No characteristical faculty of human nature, no other animal possesses this faculty, and we cannot discover in any other animal any desire to lead and direct the judgment and conduct of its fellows. Great ambition, the desire of real superiority, of leading and directing, seems to be altogether peculiar to man, and speech is the great instrument of ambition, of real superiority, of leading and directing the judgments and conducts of other people. It is always mortifying not to be believed, and it is doubly so when we suspect that it is because we are supposed to be unworthy of belief and capable of seriously and wilfully deceiving. To tell a man that he lies is of all affronts the most mortal, but whoever seriously and wilfully deceives is necessarily conscious to himself that he merits this affront, that he does not deserve to be believed, and that he forfeits all title to that sort of credit from which alone he can derive any sort of ease, comfort, or satisfaction in the society of his equals. The man who had the misfortune to imagine that nobody believed a single word he said, would feel himself the outcast of human society, would dread the very thought of going into it, or of presenting himself before it, and could scarce fail, I think, to die of despair. It is probable, however, that no man ever had just reason to entertain this humiliating opinion of himself. The most notorious liar, I am disposed to believe, tells the fair truth at least 20 times for once that he seriously and deliberately lies, and as the most cautious the disposition to believe is apt to prevail over the doubt and distrust, so in those who are the most regardless of truth the natural disposition to it prevails upon most occasions over that to deceive, or in any respect to alter or disguise it. We are mortified when we happen to deceive other people, though unintentionally, and from having been ourselves deceived. Though this involuntary falsehood may frequently be no mark of any want of veracity, of any want of the most perfect love of truth, it is always in some mark a degree of want of judgment, of want of memory, of improper credulity, of some degree of precipitancy and rashness. It always diminishes our authority to persuade, and always brings some degree of suspicion upon our fitness to lead and direct. The man who sometimes misleads from mistake, however, is widely different from him who is capable of wilfully deceiving. The former may safely be trusted upon many occasions, the latter very seldom upon any. Frankness and openness conciliate confidence. We trust the man who seems willing to trust us. We see clearly, we think the road by which he means to conduct us, and we abandon ourselves with pleasure to his guidance and direction. Reserve and concealment, on the contrary, call forth diffidence. We are afraid to follow the man who is going we do not know where. The great pleasure of conversation and society, besides, arises from a certain correspondence of sentiments and opinions, from a certain harmony of minds, which like so many musical instruments coincide and keep time with one another. But this most delightful harmony cannot be obtained unless there is a free communication of sentiments and opinions. We all desire, upon this account, to feel how each other is affected, to penetrate into each other's bosoms, and to observe the sentiments and affections which really subsist there. The man who indulges us in this natural passion, who invites us into his heart, who, as it were, sets open the gates of his breast to us, seems to exercise a species of hospitality more delightful than any other. No man who has an ordinary good temper can fail of pleasing, if he has the courage to utter his real sentiments as he feels them, and because he feels them. It is this unreserved sincerity which renders even the prattle of a child agreeable. How weak and imperfect soever the views of the open-hearted, we take pleasure to enter into them, and endeavors, as much as we can, to bring down our own understanding to the level of their capacities, and to regard every subject in the particular light in which they appear to have considered it. This passion to discover the real sentiments of others is naturally so strong, that it often degenerates into a troublesome and impertinent curiosity to pry into those secrets of our neighbors which they have very justifiable reasons for concealing, and upon many occasions it requires prudence and a strong sense of propriety to govern this, as well as all the other passions of human nature, and to reduce it to that pitch which any impartial spectator can approve of. To disappoint this curiosity, however, when it is kept within proper bounds, and aims at nothing which there can be any just reason for concealing, is equally disagreeable in its turn. The man who eludes our most innocent questions, who gives no satisfaction to our most inoffensive inquiries, who plainly wraps himself up in impenetrable obscurity, seems, as it were, to build a wall about his breast. We run forward to get within it, and all the eagerness of harmless curiosity, and feel ourselves all at once pushed back with the rudest and most offensive violence. The man of reserve and concealment, though seldom a very amiable character, is not disrespected or despised. He seems to feel coldly towards us, and feel as coldly towards him. He is not much praised or beloved, but he is as little hated or blamed. He very seldom, however, has occasion to repent his caution, and is generally disposed rather to value himself upon the prudence of his reserve. Though his conduct, therefore, may have been very faulty, and sometimes even hurtful, he can very seldom be disposed to lay his case before the casuists, or to fancy that he has any occasion for their acquittal or approbation. It is not always so with the man who, from false information, from inadvertency, from precipitancy and rashness, has involuntarily deceived. Though it should be in a matter of little consequence in telling a piece of common news, for example, if he is a real lover of the truth, he is ashamed of his own carelessness, and never fails to embrace the first opportunity of making the fullest acknowledgments. If it is in a matter of some consequence, his contrition is still greater, and if any unlucky or fatal consequence has followed from his misinformation, he can scarce ever forgive himself. Though not guilty, he feels himself to be in the highest degree what the ancients called peculiar, and is anxious and eager to make every sort of atonement in his power. Such a person might frequently be disposed to lay his case before the casuists, who have in general been very favorable to him, and though they have sometimes justly condemned him for rashness, they have universally acquitted him for the ignominy of falsehood. But the man who had the most frequent occasion to consult them was the man of equivocation and mental reservation, the man who seriously and deliberately meant to deceive, but who, at the same time, wished to flatter himself that he had really told the truth. With him they have dealt variously. When they approved very much of the motives of his deceit, they have sometimes acquitted him, though, to do them justice, they have in general and much more frequently condemned him. The chief subjects of the works of the casuists, therefore, were the conscientious regard that is due to the rules of justice, how far we ought to respect the life and property of our neighbor, the duty of restitution, the laws of chastity and modesty, and wherein consisted what in their language are called the sins of concupiscence, the rules of veracity, and the obligation of oaths, promises, and contracts of all kinds. It may be said in general of the works of the casuists that they attempted to no purpose to direct by precise rules what it belongs to feeling and sentiment only to judge of. How is it possible to ascertain by rules the exact point at which, in every case, a delicate sense of justice begins to run into a frivolous and weak scrupulosity of conscience? When it is that secrecy and reserve begin to grow into dissimulation? How far an agreeable irony may be carried, and at what precise point it begins to degenerate into a detestable lie? What is the highest pitch of freedom and ease of behavior which can be regarded as graceful and becoming? And when it is that it first begins to run into a negligent and thoughtless licentiousness? With regard to all such matters, what would hold good in any case would scarce do so exactly in any other, and what constitutes the propriety and happiness of behavior varies in every case with the smallest variety of situation. Books of casuistry, therefore, are generally as useless as they are commonly tiresome. They could be of little use to one who should consult them upon occasion, even supposing their decisions to be just, because, notwithstanding the multitude of cases collected in them, yet upon account of the still greater variety of possible circumstances, it is a chance if among all those cases there be found one exactly parallel to that under consideration. One who is really anxious to do his duty must be very weak, if he can imagine that he has much occasion for them, and with regard to one who is negligent of it, the style of those writings is not such as to likely to awaken him to more attention. None of them tend to animate us to what is generous and noble. None of them tend to soften us to what is gentle and humane. Many of them, on the contrary, tend rather to teach us to chicane with our own consciences, and by their vain subtleties serve to authorize innumerable evasive refinements with regard to the most essential articles of our duty. That frivolous accuracy which they attempted to introduce into subjects which do not admit of, most necessarily betrayed them into those dangerous errors, and at the same time rendered their works dry and disagreeable, abounding in abstruse and metaphysical distinctions, but incapable of exciting in the heart any of those emotions which it is the principal use of books of morality to excite. The two useful parts of moral philosophy, therefore, are ethics and jurisprudence. Casuistry ought to be rejected altogether, and the ancient moralists appear to have judged much better, who, in treating of the same subjects, did not affect any such nice exactness, but contented themselves with describing, in a general manner, what is the sentiment upon which justice, modesty, and veracity are founded, and what is the ordinary way of acting to which those virtues would commonly prompt us. Something, indeed, not unlike the doctrine of the casuists, seemed to have been attempted by several philosophers. There is something of this kind in the third book of Cicero's Offices, where he endeavors, like a casuist, to give rules for our conduct in many nice cases, in which it is difficult to determine whereabouts the point of propriety may lie. It appears, too, from many passages in the same book, that several other philosophers had attempted something of the same kind before him. Neither he nor they, however, appear to have aimed at giving a complete system of this sort, but only meant to show how situations may occur, in which it is doubtful whether the highest propriety of conduct consists in observing or in receding from what, in ordinary cases, are the rules of duty. Every system of positive law may be regarded as a more or less imperfect attempt towards a system of natural jurisprudence, or towards an enumeration of the particular rules of justice, as the violation of justice is what men will never submit to from one another. The public magistrate is under a necessity of employing the power of the commonwealth to enforce the practice of this virtue. Without this precaution, civil society would become a scene of bloodshed and disorder, every man revenging himself at his own hand whenever he fancied he was injured. To prevent the confusion which would attend upon every man's doing justice to himself, the magistrate, in all governments that have acquired any considerable authority, undertakes to do justice to all, and promises to hear and to redress every complaint of injury. In all well-governed states, too, not only judges are appointed for determining the controversies of individuals, but rules prescribed for regulating the decisions of those judges, and these rules are, in general, intended to coincide with those of natural justice. It does not, indeed, always happen that they do in every instance. Sometimes what is called the constitution of the state, that is the interest of our government, sometimes the interest of particular orders of men who tyrannize the government, warp the positive laws of the country from what natural justice would prescribe. In some countries the rudeness and barbarism of the people hinder the natural sentiments of justice from arriving at that accuracy and precision which, in more civilized nations, they naturally attain to. Their laws are, like their manners, gross and rude and undistinguishing. In other countries the unfortunate constitution of their courts of judicature hinders any regular system of jurisprudence from ever establishing itself among them. Though the improved manners of the people may be such as would admit the most accurate, in no country do the decisions of positive law coincide exactly in every case with the rules which the natural sense of justice would dictate. Systems of positive law, therefore, though they deserve the greatest authority as the records of the sentiments of mankind in different ages and nations, yet can never be regarded as accurate systems of the rules of natural justice. It might have been expected that the reasonings of lawyers upon the different imperfections and improvements of the laws of different countries should have given occasion to an inquiry into what were the natural rules of justice independent of all positive institution. It might have been expected that these reasonings should have led them to aim at establishing a system of what might properly be called natural jurisprudence, or a theory of general principles which ought to run through and be the foundation of the laws of all nations. But though the reasonings of lawyers did produce something of this kind, and though no man has treated systematically of the laws of any particular country without intermixing in his work many observations of this sort, it was very late in the world before any such general system was thought of, or before philosophy of law was treated of by itself, and without regard to the particular institutions of any one nation. In none of the ancient moralists do we find any attempt toward a particular enumeration of the rules of justice. Cicero in his Offices and Aristotle in his Ethics treat of justice in the same general manner in which they treat of all other virtues. In the laws of Cicero and Plato, where we might naturally have expected some attempts towards an enumeration of those rules of natural equity which ought to be enforced by the positive laws of every country, there is, however, nothing of this kind. Their laws are laws of police, not of justice. Grotius seems to have been the first who attempted to give the world anything like a system of those principles which ought to run through, and be the foundation of laws of all nations, and his treatise of the laws of war and peace, with all its imperfections, is perhaps at this day the most complete work that has yet been given upon this subject. I shall in another discourse endeavor to give an account of the general principles of law and government, and of the different revolutions which have undergone in different ages and periods of society, not only in what concerns justice, but in what concerns police, revenue, and arms, and whatever else the object of law. I shall not, therefore, at present, enter into any further detail concerning the history of jurisprudence.